Tim, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. I'm a professor at Knox Theological Seminary down in Fort Lauderdale. I'm actually native of Florida. My family's been down here for a long time, so kind of rare for Florida people. And teach philosophy and theology. Actually started off I was a physicist at Georgia Tech and planning to stay in that, but got really frustrated with how the church handled issues of science and theology and got super interested in time and the nature of time from my physics studies, and so kind of shifted over into more of the philosophy of science and the conversation about theology and science and how religion and science relate.
Awesome. So the topic today is science compatible with theology? Could you tell me your position on that?
Yeah, I mean, so yes. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't make for a long podcast, but sure. I mean, I think the compatibility questions are. There are kinds of theology, there's kinds of religions that certainly aren't, but historically the idea of the warfare of science and religion stuff is just not real. It's not realistic to the history of the study of science.
Well, I think as the jure science has literally been warring against religion kind of a thing, I would agree. But it seems like de facto it is the case that as science literacy increases and scientific discovery increases, dependency on religion seems to decrease. So like if we look at academic studies of the National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society, the percent of people who are religious in those institutions is significantly lower than the average population. And the more educated you become, the lower the amount of religiosity is. And so it seems like while there isn't like a direct war that science is waging, it seems that as people have more of the science, they have less religion.
Yeah, well, I think that some of that comes down to even where, how is religion functioning in a person's life, and what is it trying to explain? One of the courses I teach, we talk about, atheism. It really was, in some sense, it was almost an impossible position as a comprehensive worldview until you get into the Enlightenment, and really even more recent than that. I mean, you basically without something like the Big Bang Theory and evolution, it's tough to have that kind of comprehensive picture. So you could certainly reject the existence of a deity, but you don't have a narrative that gets you to the present without it. And so, I think you're in a position now where science, then moving beyond just the sort of the program of science, and the science word is a kind of a slippery word depending on what people mean, but with modern science and with the modern theoretical structures that we've got, there's a much more realistic, comprehensive worldview that you can build without any reference to God. But you got some trouble points, maybe beginnings, and some things like morality. But you can build out a comprehensive worldview without reference to God that works.
Yeah, and it seems like the discovery of that the God was essentially used as a God of the gaps. We don't know how to explain something. God seems to make intuitive sense to us, therefore God. And as we discovered more things like evolution and the Big Bang, and I think morality will be among that list in the future, the need for God or the ability for God to fill those gaps diminished. And so it seems to be the case that like science is demonstrating God to be nothing but a God of the gaps for the most part. And it seems like that is a rational conclusion to draw based off of using the scientific method and just science in general, which would then lead to a conflict between science and theology.
Well, I mean, not really. I mean, I would say you really can't get to the point of a conflict, right? Because deism is old. Deism is not a conflict position. Deism is one. I mean, deism is not a position I'd support, but deism kind of gives you an explanation for the beginning. You don't have to talk about multiverse, which multiverse really is it's just a different way of saying, something we don't understand. I mean, whether God is the something we don't understand or the multiverse is, you get an explanation for a beginning, you get an explanation for the rationality and the order. I don't see how you can get to a place where there's a conflict, but I think you can get to a place where deism, I think one of the problems with it is you might as well not believe. You kind of use it to get a little bit of moralistic relief. You get a foundation for morality, you get some therapy, somebody who loves you even if everything's bad, and otherwise it doesn't matter that God's there.
Well, I would say that the principles that science teaches us omits certain methodologies. It says this methodology definitely doesn't work and it doesn't give us a way to differentiate imagination from reality. So,
Oh
like
yeah. So
anecdotal.
absolutely, in terms of methodology, this is something that that I try to distinguish with students that come in that are they're in some senses they feel like they're not allowed to like naturalism at all, and to talk through like, listen, when you're doing science, there's a methodological assumption of naturalism, or else you won't keep poking at the mysteries and the hard spots. And most of the stuff that's the most fun in science happens at those places where we're like, I don't know what's going on here. And if we just say, oh, God's doing it. I mean, Newton doing that over the way he'd calculated the orbits is a tragedy, because he probably could have solved some of these things. And his motivation was flawed, and the God of the gaps is flawed. So it's definitely the methodology of it. I would never support sort of an expectation of miracle or writing God in anytime we don't understand. That just cuts off the scientific process altogether. And I mean, wonder at the world and an interest in looking into it, I think, is beautiful.
Oh, right. But I think I'm going to make a more specific point here where as science progresses, we discover more flawed methodologies, and those methodologies we put in the trash bin of history and say, you can't use this. This is bad. And it seems like those methodologies are the ones that pretty much entirely are the basis of religious belief. Like all of the ones that support belief in religion are the ones that are going to be put in the trash bin by science, which would then seem to lead to a conflict, because if all of the things that lead to a belief in a god are things that science considers to be garbage methodologies that do not work, leading to no justification for a belief in a god, then it seems rational that there is definitely going to be a conflict there, especially since science is going to have some kind of methodological requirement that if you make some kind of an assertion of God or whatever, you're going to need some positive justification or evidence to justify that belief. And if all of your justifications are of the kind that science has demonstrated are unreliable and are in the trash bin, then you no longer have a basis of justification for belief in a god, which would then put it on the same level as leprechauns, fairies, Santa Claus, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think what I would say is that there are the methodologies. When we start getting into epistemology and sort of the bigger picture of what we can believe behind the, sort of behind the entities that we're studying when we're looking at the phenomena in science, some of the methodologies that have been disregarded there, verificationism and falsificationism, were really built to be scientific epistemology, and those ended up failing because there were things even within the sciences that they couldn't explain in terms of underlying reality. So, I mean, look, in terms of how people view it, this is one of the interesting things. I mean, even when you start talking about things like the proofs, and I don't use that word, but the arguments for God's existence, the thing that's odd about them is whether they're compelling to people. And that sort of seems to vary from person to person. I mean, the question of where did it all come from and why is there something instead of nothing at all, I think is probably going to remain a compelling question to a lot of people for a long time. And I think other people, they don't seem to find it compelling at all. And so I think that's where, I doubt that you're right, that those kinds of arguments lose all ability to compel people long term. But some people find them just ridiculous.
Well, I'm not as interested in the compellingness factor. I think like the interesting question is like, if we discovered artificial intelligence, or we built an artificial intelligence, it's essentially just going to be a logic processor unit, not going to be as many emotional bias problems as we have. It's just going to be like, here's the evidence. This is it. I don't care. And so if you consider, is it going to be an atheist or Christian based on the evidence? I'm like, there's no chance it's going to be a Christian. It's as likely to believe Harry Potter is a real person as it is to believe Jesus is the Son of God. And I think that conclusion is going to be based on science. It's going to be using science to come to its conclusions about the world, and it's going to omit God because of the scientific method and its requirements to build justification. And with those requirements, religious belief doesn't even come close. It's exactly the same as I would consider Harry Potter or magic or miracles or
Yeah.
leprechauns.
And as a speculation, I mean, I hear you. I think we can both speculate on it. I think that some of the, a lot of it will depend on how we're programmed out to do it. But I hear you. I don't think that's the way it'll work. I mean, it's kind of hard when we're speculating about the future to sort of guesswork at it. Religion's been declared dead plenty of times historically, and certain aspects of religion have died.
Sure, but doesn't it seem like there's a very consistent pattern we can see as science increases, religion decreases? It seems like that's a very consistent pattern.
I would say the pattern historically has been more of a rotation. Yeah, I mean, certainly atheism within the scientific community, in terms of what you were referring to early, is very true. Although then you see patterns within that where the level of atheism within the physics community is lower than it is in the biological community. And if you look at the studies, some of physics and this presumption of elegance, as in many, for not for everybody, but for many people, the presumption that elegance is better evidence for the truth and reality of a theory than evidence is really kind of, I mean, it's an oddly religious kind of commitment, even though you can just claim, hey, I just think it's a rational order, and I don't know why it is, but fine.
Well, sure. In the case of physics, there's a caveat there that it only applies to principles, particles, and laws and combinations that have been discovered to exist. So in physics, you're only allowed to use combinations of things that have already been demonstrated to exist to make those elegant models. You're not allowed to add in magic or miracles or leprechauns. If you do, it's immediately thrown out. It's not even on the table anymore. It's not even physics. And so
you're allowed to predict things that nobody's seen before, and then go test and see whether they're there. But the underlying reality that, hey, this is going to be this, that elegance is going to be so inherent in the structure of the universe that we can make predictions on that basis. It's look, it's fascinating. It's not compelling to everybody. It's a thing. That's part of why I think there's a difference. It's a lot uglier to watch wildebeest cross a river in the middle of Africa than it is to be studying particles and be staring at mathematics. That's just spectacular.
Oh, sure. But in physics, the elegance only relates to models that can be built off of previously empirically demonstrated principles, particles, and laws. So you can't add in God there. That's just not physics anymore. And so the elegance relates to elegance of the standard model and how you can get the particles to relate in such a way that it makes a simple,
sure. But I'm pointing to the elegance as the why is it this way instead of some other. I mean, that's really that's this underlying question that I think, that the Leibniz kind of why is there something instead of nothing, and why is it this way instead of some other way? It's still odd that it is this elegant.
Now, sure, but I think.
But in terms of the theory you put in, yeah, but when we get to origins, when we get to beginnings of the universe, the multiverse realistically, I mean, I think by the definition that you've just provided, would defy that principle. You can't posit the multiverse. There's no evidence for the multiverse. There can't be evidence, and it's untestable.
Well, the multiverse is a combination of two things. It's a combination of Goose early universe inflation and energy density of space demonstrated in the Casimir effect. So we've observed both of these things, the Casimir effect and Goose early universe inflation made predictions about observations in the cosmic microwave background radiation. So both of those things have empirical evidence. And if you combine them, the combination of those two things produces, if you infer the conclusion, the multiverse. So the multiverse is just a combination of confirmed physics. The combination hasn't been verified, but each of the parts has been verified.
Can't be verified.
Well, that's irrelevant. So each of the parts has been verified. So if it's like I say,
parts, but there's that's not the only explanatory framework that could explain those things. So you're positing a thing that can't be tested in order to explain it away. Again.
Well, the only point here is that if you use a theory that is only a combination of known parts, that's going to be a better, simpler, ontologically simpler theory than adding in leprechauns or magic or something. And so
yeah.
I agree. I don't like the multiverse. I like it better than the many worlds. The many worlds I think is even more ridiculous. But the limit in physics is that you're only allowed to use combinations of principles, particles, and laws that have been demonstrated to exist. You're not allowed to add in new ontologies, magic, miracles, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. Those are out. Those, if you add those in, it's no longer physics. It's not even in the
I think you're making a definition though that sort of limits things there in terms of even when you use the supernatural. I understand you're not going to agree with this particular mode of thought, but my professor Diogenes Allen, Austin Fair, the philosopher Austin Fair, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. One of the things that he poked at was this very definition of the natural, and that there can be natural properties of things that have not yet been revealed because we haven't put we haven't put together the right circumstance in which it could be revealed. And so even in the sense of Jesus walking on water, right? So that idea that this was a supernatural event Well, not if there are qualities to molecules and that we just don't know about in terms of how they would respond to their creator. Now, do I
Sure.
expect somebody to get on board with that? No, absolutely not. But what the illustration is just that even the word supernatural, I mean, to me, the multiverse, and again, you've said that's not you're not a favor of it, but the multiverse is there's little that's elegant or simple about the ontological monstrosity that it is.
Oh, sure, but like, I grant that there's no like strict definition of natural and supernatural. It would be up to the person who is arguing that there is a new ontology, whether that's a heaven or a god or whatever, to say that this new ontology has property X and it can be demonstrated with this novel prediction or something. And you can just classify that as supernatural and say this is the supernatural things. That part I'm not particularly, I don't find as important. What matters when I'm using the distinction between natural and supernatural is things that have already been demonstrated to not be imaginary versus things that have yet to be demonstrated or not imaginary. And so I'm simply using the supernatural category as a category of any assertion of some kind of ontology that has yet to be demonstrated isn't imaginary. So magic, miracles,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think you're defining. I mean, and it's fair in terms of methodology. We should have that methodological naturalism. But if we're talking about God, if the question is God as a person and not God as a force, then it's never going to be able to be studied by physics in that way. And so the question of what people will believe as a result of that, I think it's an interesting question, predicting the future on that. But I wouldn't. There'd be no way to say, hey, I have belief in a personal God. I think it has this explanatory power for origins, for morality, for these other areas that's superior to any other kind of general theory. But because we're talking about a person who's responsible for an orderly creation, the fact that a person, psychology is never going to be on the level of physics, sociology is never going to be on the level of physics, that because it's a person and therefore it has a lack of predictability, we shouldn't posit it at all. That's now an epistemological, like an absolute in terms of epistemology that's outside of the realm of physics too. So
Well, I
yeah,
don't see why is that outside of the realm? Because that seems to be squarely in the realm of physics, where it says if you don't have any evidence for a thing that we can't investigate, whether it be by physics or any other method, like if you would have to provide another method, or it's just unjustified. It's just like leprechauns. If we can't investigate it, you're not allowed to rationally posit it.
well, but the investigation part I think is the interesting. I had to think about that for a little bit in terms of the having to be able to investigate it, because the investigation process in terms of saying, what if if the multiverse is only an explanation for things that have already happened and it has no ongoing testability, it has no ongoing impact. So going back to something like deism, to say we can't even say with a deist that God started the universe, even if we think it provides the best answer to the question of why is there something instead of nothing, even if we think it provides the best answer to morality, all of this, that if we say now we can't even posit it because we can't test it going forward, now physics has stepped out of the field of being a discipline of science.
Why? Because that seems like it would be science. So it's like saying, say we see a hoof print in the snow. We don't know what caused it. We can't go back in time and see what caused it. Could it have been a leprechaun? Well, no, leprechaun's out. That's not a rational hypothesis. There's no evidence of leprechauns. That one's out. You can't use that. You could say horse. Yes, horse is fine. You could say an elephant, even if it's in the Arctic. Like, all right, elephants possible. We know they exist. So it seems unlikely, but maybe it's possible. Leprechaun's out. Unicorns out. Nope, you can't have those. Aliens. Nope. Maybe aliens are slightly more plausible. But yeah, like it seems like there is a limit to the things that are rational to posit caused the hoof print in the snow. And
sure, but why is God? And I get it. If you compare it to leprechauns and Papa Smurf, like some of the comments along the side and all of that, then fair enough. But I would say God's probably in a different category there than leprechauns, and the hoof print is a pretty minimal. Yeah, obviously horse is the first start with that, and I would agree with you that aliens is implausible, but slightly more. But where does God come in? I mean, it seems like you're making a selection in terms of the irresponsibility of positing God when you've got a massively big effect, and so positing a massively big cause is reasonable.
well, I wouldn't say so. So I think this would apply to any phenomenon we see. Let's say we see a galaxy explode or something big. Saying leprechaun still doesn't work in that case. It's still irrational to say leprechaun. Horse is still better than leprechaun if you want to say what
Sure.
caused the universe to explode. And so the limitation here is things that are only made of properties that have been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination versus an entity that has at least one property that has not yet been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination. So anything that has one property that has of this new ontology kind that hasn't been demonstrated to exist is of the mystical variety, the supernatural variety. And anything that's a combination of known principles, particles, and laws is of the rational variety. And so I think that is the differentiation. That's why I think it is rational to compare God to leprechauns, Papa Smurf, whatever, because any of those entities has at least one property that has not yet been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination. In the case of leprechauns, it's magic. God, it's a mind outside of space-time, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, et cetera, et cetera. For unicorns, it's the magical poop or whatever. There's all of these supernatural entities have some property out there, which may or may not be natural. They could be a fundamental part of the universe that we just haven't discovered yet, but they have no evidence that they actually exist independent of our imagination. Whereas like the multiverse, everything in the multiverse, every piece of the multiverse has evidence it exists independent of our imagination. The combination, we don't know, but each of the parts, absolutely. And I think that's the difference between a rational hypothesis and a spurious hypothesis. And I think that's what science, the methodology of science, says about what we should infer about hypotheses.
Yeah, and I think that, so I would say when I speak to the beginning of the universe, and we're talking about the beginning of time and space, so there's not an end. We can't use what's in time and space to explain a beginning of those very things. So, but all we're getting to there is something bigger than this. And I think you're, in my opinion, as I've looked at it, and look, I've been out of the physics side of it for a little bit longer, but the evidence for the multiverse is I think weaker than that in terms of, yeah, it explains these things, but it's more of a, we don't know how to explain it, so let's come up with something. The idea that the something is just bigger than this universe and outside of it in space and time, that God would be an irrevocable or an impossible posit there. I just don't see that logic as falling over. Now, obviously, the thing about these arguments is they're compelling to some and not compelling to others. So I think you're growing the point out there, and the origin of the universe, that, yeah, there are other possible explanations, but I don't know that they're more reasonable.
Well, that's the part I'm not understanding a little bit. So like if I said origin of the universe is just a phenomenon like any other, saying leprechaun still super unreasonable.
But it's not, it can't be like any other. I mean, that's the thing about it, is because every other is, I mean, even as we understand it, even the shape of the forces that are controlling the universe are changing in that moment. The time in which things can occur is beginning. So it is beyond the measure. I mean, we talk about this very, very early in the expansion of the universe, the kind of point where we don't understand what was going on anymore. Now, I'm not trying to throw, once time and space have started, the learning and how far back we'll be able to go, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me. I think it's really interesting, and I'm interested to see how it plays, how that plays out. But in terms of why is there something instead of nothing, that's still a kind of question that goes beyond physics, because physics explains how we got something from something, not how we got something from nothing. Even the multiverse lacks an explanation.
Well, I don't think you can get something from nothing, but that's so I think that if we want to go back to the universe, saying a leprechaun did it seems based on your methodology, it's rational to say a leprechaun did it. And I think that is false. I think science is always going to say that is false. You can't do that. That is anti-science, the pseudoscience, to say a leprechaun did it. For any unknown we ever see, can't say a leprechaun did it until you have evidence of leprechauns. I think that is a fundamental principle of science. And the same thing would apply to God. You can't say God did it until you have evidence of God. And
well, I think that's actually, hang on, I actually don't think that's true. I think if I posited leprechauns, now, I don't want to do that, and I really am not super happy about saying that on a recorded session. But let's say I want to posit leprechauns, right? So I'm going to posit leprechauns, and then I'm going to build out a theory. I'm building out a model of the universe in which I say, really, the existence of leprechauns is necessary to explain these other features of the universe. Now, that does have a feature that can then be, I mean, potentially is explanatory, even if the other features are later testable, or leprechauns existed in the past. And we can posit these things, but then they should have some kind of explanatory value to the overall system. And that's where, the idea that we posit God, and that some of the explanatory value of that is it helps us to understand rationality. It helps us to understand the consistency, the structure of the universe. It helps us to understand the beginning of the universe. That as a theoretical framework to say, I believe that God created an orderly universe, a cosmos, that has a function in my theory of the world, my understanding, my overall worldview, even if, because I'm positing him as a person, it's not providing me with individual testability along the way.
Right, but I think this seems to be the anti-science. It seems to be fundamentally anti-science. I think that
in the field of, I would be, but I'm like, there's not. I don't think you could point to a place where I've been. You're going to say overall, but I don't think you could point to a place where I have been anti-science. I mean, I love the pursuit of science. I agree with the methodology of the naturalistic methodology is the right approach. The discoveries of how the universe works. If I hear people positing a God of the gaps to explain, where did something come from, I immediately roll my eyes and want somebody to shut up, because it's not I don't think that that's how the natural order goes on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I would say that what you did with the leprechaun there is a God of the gaps. And so simply saying that it has some kind of explanatory role in your model, that it can explain the data, is nothing but a God of the gaps. Like, science doesn't allow that. You're not allowed to say, I'm going to posit a leprechaun to explain the fine structure constant of the universe. Do we know what caused it? Nope, we have no idea what causes the fine structure constant of the universe. Are you allowed to posit a leprechaun in science? Nope. Immediately paper thrown out. No, you're not allowed to do this.
So let me, but actually we have done that. So the hidden variable, and ended up, Einstein posited a hidden variable to try to get to try to solve the question of the apparent irrationality or just randomness of quantum mechanics. And then it became something to try to then work the math out and test it. But we do that all the time, where we try to throw some feature in and see if it works and then test it out in the model. And some of it gets verified. I mean, that's what a lot of string theorists, a lot of what we're supposed to get out of these colliders are posited pieces of proof. And the Higgs boson was one of those we were able to then test. There's other ones that we aren't even sure we could ever theoretically test to be able to find out if they exist. So we are positing something to help solve a model, to make a model work.
Yeah, but all those things are things that are combinations of principles and particles and laws that have already been demonstrated to exist. So none of those are analogous to leprechaun or magic. So all of those things are
sure the hidden variable is. I mean, I guess maybe then I'd need to follow, like, when you talk about that language, we're building out a framework. I mean, to me, I'm struggling to see how the leprechaun then, like, maybe it's how I put it together in connection with your theory. But the idea of positing a thing that provides a general explanatory framework, that is part of what happens a lot. And then we try to do testability of it, of the overall theory. I mean, these models are not the models that we build of the universe. There's plenty of unknowns that are still left in there. We don't know what it actually looks like underneath those. So yeah, again, I just may not be following the way you're writing that, the way you're listening.
All right. So in physics, any equation or thing that you use in order to build a model has to be a combination of things that have been empirically verified. You're not allowed to just ad hoc something into the theory. You can't do that in physics. It's a derivative equation. You're only allowed to use things that are a combination of previously discovered laws. Now, you can make new combinations, like if you want to, it's like Lego pieces.
But that's not how that's not true. I mean, that's just fundamentally not how physics has worked in plenty of circumstances where people are trying to figure out how to solve things. We build models out, and sometimes the models imply things. Yeah. Are we building on the backs of what's already been done? Yes. But there's plenty of times that you theorize something to try to then test it and build the math out, or the math proposes something that you haven't seen in reality and try to look for it. Like, I mean, that's just like, as people are trying to solve these puzzles, especially when you get to places where the old solutions aren't working, throwing out theories that might have explanatory power, and then sort of even just testing them mathematically where there's no empirical test, and that is something that gets done.
Not for ad hoc insertions, no. So like the most ad hoc things you can insert are like Pauli making up a constant just because he intuits it. But it's not accepted because he intuits it. It's not accepted because the math is elegant. It's accepted because it makes empirical tests, which they can confirm. So you can make up whatever you want, but until you can confirm it with a novel prediction, it's just ad hoc. It's nothing. It's a nothing burger until it's been confirmed, unless it's a combination of previously demonstrated things, in which case it's better than just an ad hoc assertion. So ad hoc assertions, you can make them, but they're useless until they've been confirmed with some novel prediction. And that's why physics is limited to using combinations of verified principles and particles to try to make things that are unknown, like WIMPs, to explain dark matter. They're using combinations of other existing physics that we know is there to get to those, instead of just, like, I could posit a magical leprechaun essence that explains dark matter, and that may be able to explain all of the data perfectly well. But since there's no actual evidence that that combination of things exists, until I could confirm some prediction with it, it's just junk. No one cares whatsoever. Whereas,
I mean, fundamentally, I do think the people do care, and they go look for it, and we spend huge amounts of money looking for things that sometimes we end up not finding. I mean, I think you're limiting the physics method and the role of imagination in ways that Einstein himself talked about imagination as being one of the key features for a good scientist. Now, I do agree they can't sit there long term without doing anything, but I would also disagree with you that the role of God in a picture of the whole world is the same as the role of leprechauns within this little tiny universe. But look,
why?
Because the God question, the leprechaun doesn't answer. The leprechaun just sits there as, and whatever. I'd have to try to figure out, like, what would constitute evidence that would make somebody want to posit leprechauns. Hey, there's stories about them. I don't know what that is. The questions that arise, again, the compelling issue, whatever. But the questions that arise out of the cosmological argument, some of the fine tuning of this universe, the ways this world looks, the existence of a universe at all, the existence of something instead of nothing. Those are real questions that God provides a real answer to, and I think it would be those are real questions that I think many people will continue to find to be more troubling for the atheistic worldview than it is for the theistic worldview. Now, there's other aspects of the universe that I think people will find more troubling for theism than they do for atheism. As we speculate our AI computer long term, I don't know what that looks like, 300 years from now.
Well, so the claim you made there about it being more troubling for the atheistic universe than the theistic universe, I see that as just objectively false. It seems like the only justification for positing a God is our anthropocentric fallacy of hyperactive agency detection. It seems the reason we posit a God to explain fine tuning or anything, it seems to be the same reason we explain Zeus caused lightning. It's the exact same fallacious, emotive kind of justification we get from evolution that has no rational basis in reality. It's one of the things that science says, now, this is a trash bin thing. We're not allowed to use this as a justification. The fact that we intuitively think, oh, pattern mind must have done it, that's out. That's not rational. And it seems like science just definitively says you can't use that. That one's gone. That's just intelligent design is pseudoscience. Like, that's just a thing in science. And it seems like a good way to do that. We should say, oh, if this is a bias that we have internally due to evolution that causes us to come to a certain kind of a conclusion, that one is not scientific. That's just kind of useless. Whereas I did want to comment a little bit more on where you said that it would be harder for the atheistic worldview to explain these things. I don't understand that one bit. It seems like I can posit an undiscovered law of physics to explain all of this, and that is infinitely better than a God, as far as I can tell. And so
I really, that's where I think, and I think it's hard to distinguish those two. I mean, the word, whether we use the word God or we use the word undiscovered law of physics, whatever the word we're using, when we're saying there's something beyond what we've got in terms of limitations of this universe, and we don't know what it is. And it's different than this. It's outside of the bounds of that, but we're not going to be able to test it. The sort of presumption that somehow the word God stands in worse position on that, I think that's just an assumption on your part versus being something that you can demonstrate or argue.
Well, let me try to argue it. Let me see what you think. So
yeah, I mean, fair enough. In a way that's, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So minds, as far as we can tell, are exclusively a product of brains, which are exclusively a product of biology, which is a product of chemistry, which is a product of physics, which is a product of quantum fields. And so to say that there was a mind that produced quantum fields would be equivalent to say there was a pineapple that produced a quantum field. All pineapples we know of are a higher order emergent property of all of these systems, and there's none of them that exist prior to these systems. And so to make an argument that there was some kind of a mind that existed outside of these things has no rational basis, any more than to say that there is a pineapple outside of the universe. However, we can rationally say that quantum fields, even if we didn't, we have actually evidence. The consensus in physics right now is space-time is emergent from quantum fields because of the tests we can run in the field. But let's assume there's no test and there's no evidence of this. We just don't know. It's still more rational to infer something of the lower order things, the physics or the quantum fields, predated the physics and quantum fields and had some kind of effect there, than to say that someone of the higher order things like pineapples or minds did.
Yeah, and I think the problem for you with even the reference to the quantum mechanics and how that goes is you still have to have that quantum mechanical system. You have to have that universe existing in a way that is separate from the space and time in which it exists. And the theorizing
that applies to everything. So it applies to every known thing. So if we want to say minds, the same thing applies. All known versions of minds exist inside of space-time. So to posit a mind outside of space-time, you're essentially taking a fundamental property of mind and saying there's an exception clause. But I can just do the same thing with quantum fields. I can say, okay, so here's the quantum fields we have. They're all inside of space-time, but I'm going to make an exception clause for quantum fields and say this one's outside of space-time.
Yeah,
but
so you make
rational. But this is where the more rational part comes in, is that if there's a hierarchy of things, from the most fundamental being quantum fields as far as we know, then physics, chemistry, biology, minds, etc., to say something that's closer to the top is more likely to be the exception, is more rational than to say something near the bottom like minds or pineapples is going to be the exception.
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems we get into when we start saying things like more rational and building all of that out is we're presuming we've got essentially presumptions and prior commitments that make that. In terms of what I would say is, if I'm looking at just that, all I'm going to get from there needs to be an origin is something outside of space and time. So if you were to say what gives God preference over the two, I'd say with that alone, I can't say that God has a preference between the two. But it is not the quantum mechanics outside of space and time is the deposit of at some level a leprechaun. It's something that we can't. It's more like what we see every day, but it's still not what we see every day because it exists without this reference in which the time most fundamentally is the problem because of the lack of a time framework in which this thing occurs. But and I understand you guys go through this on the podcast all the time. The morality that you get out of evolution is not the kind of morality that most people feel is the reality of the world. Now, it's easy enough to say, well, yeah, people feel wrong. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so powerful, and it wouldn't be so. It wouldn't do the work that evolution needed it to do. The elegance of the universe, the sort of the actual rise of mind, the existence of people who worship and people who have this sense of God, and some people have it more than others. Obviously, it's probably a surprise, but I'm a little bit more of a skeptic, and I've tended not to have a lot of the deep religious experience that people, that some people describe. But for them, that's going to be more compelling than anything because they had this direct experience of a mind that wasn't theirs. Now we can psychologize that and all of that, but in terms of what becomes most compelling, I think that's where the broad explanatory frameworks, when we start trying to explain the world, it's hard to make those kinds of judgments, narrow judgments, like this one is the more rational one because of the breadth that we're trying to explain.
Well, that's the part I'm not sure I would agree with, because I think science will have an objective answer here and say that one is more rational. And I think the reason is
I don't think so. I mean, even the evolutionary and look, a lot of this is lost in history. I mean, evolutionary epistemology has difficulty because it can't go back and see the actual circumstances. So we can say, here's a feature we have right now. We have a sense of morality. So therefore it has
right. The morality thing is slightly separate. So I want to stick on the physics thing for
now. Yeah, sorry.
But so like in the case of physics, when we're talking about what came before the Big Bang, it seems like the models of physics that predict that, like the string theory, mini worlds, multiverse, quantum fields, quantum foam, all of those are using known physics and trying to solve the equations with less variables. They try to remove the variables, they try to remove the lambda, remove the space-time, see if you can solve the derivative equations without the space-time. Yes, we can solve it without the space-time, which means fundamentally the space-time may not be the most core feature of reality. Maybe these other things are the core feature of reality. The quantum fields, space-time can emerge from these things. And so because they're using combinations of known principles, particles, and laws that have been empirically demonstrated to exist and trying to combine them in different ways to show that these other ones can solve the equations without reference to space-time, therefore they could be more fundamental than space-time, seems like a more rational reason to infer that they could be the cause of space-time than to say God or a mind or a pineapple did it or a leprechaun did it. Those seem to be purely just our imagination, just inferring things, whereas these using these equations to try to actually solve the things that we know refer to reality in different ways. And if they can come up with the correct solutions, because they're combinations of things that have been empirically demonstrated to exist, seems like a much objectively more rational way to come to a conclusion about what was prior to the Big Bang, which is why I think that's all that physics does. I don't think they're allowed to just be God did it. That's not even a thing in papers. There are all of the inferences about what came prior to the Big Bang, the loop quantum gravity theory, Sean Carroll's like two-way time theory. They're all just using these combinations of things and combining them in different ways to solve the derivative equations of the Big Bang and the universe in different ways to try to figure out that this property is fundamental or this property is fundamental. And that seems like a perfectly rational way to try to figure out what was prior to the Big Bang, even though we can't directly access it. Whereas going with God or leprechauns or pineapples, that seems like it's nowhere even analogous to the rationality of the process being used by physics to infer these things.
Yeah, and I appreciate you use the word "seems like," but when we talk about even those mathematical references, I mean, those, it's not as simple as just saying we know these things refer to reality. I mean, that's a deep issue in the philosophy of physics, that even the t that we use in formulas, the t that we use for time, represent this. How, to what degree does that actually represent what time itself is, or to what degree is it a mathematical model, is a huge area of controversy. It has nothing to do with philosophy of religion, by the way.
Right.
The reference problem, just because we can make a formula that does things, doesn't give it any more, like, doesn't give it any viability in terms of reality. So hey, we can create a formula that works without t or space. I don't see that as being compellingly different to saying, hey, we can make something up that explains this.
Well, I want to explore that a little bit. So like,
Yeah,
each of the variables in the core equations of the universe, without going into the theoretical framework, all of the things about general and special relativity, etc., are confirmed by novel prediction. So they're like, Einstein had a hypothesis that general and special relativity are true. If this is the case, we're going to see an extra curvature of light around the sun that was not predicted by Newtonian gravity, and we confirmed it. So his equation was just a made up thing, may or may not objectively refer to reality, but it made a successful novel prediction. So now it has justification to believe it does correspond to reality to some degree. We have evidence. We have reason to believe these equations correspond to reality. And all of the equations in physics that are used in the foundational descriptions of the universe are like that. They've all made successful predictions. Pauli's exclusion principle, Noether's theorem, they've all made novel predictions that have been confirmed. And those are the base equations in physics. These are the ones that are, yep, these are solid. These we can use.
But that's,
as Lego
even
pieces.
that goes a little bit. So like the question of time and the nature of time, there's an existing, and the question of indeterminacy, there's a question about that goes, depending on, to some degree, depending whether you're talking to people who are more on the quantum mechanics side than on the special general relativity side. The t that's in the physics equations, which does great at making predictions of how things will go forward in time. There is there's a really significant debate in the philosophy of physics, because that t looks like it's spread out and that time is basically eternally existent. It looks like a reference frame from which, like, the whole universe based from some reference point, which some people will talk about the God's eye view, and even in physics, but they're making a point about frame of reference. It looks like all of time exists at once. And then there's other ways in which it looks like, that time, there's only the existence of a real present. And so physics can posit time travel, for example. And then there's a legit debate on whether time travel is actually impossible just because of the nature of time. And part of the question is, does t in the math actually represent reality? this is a ongoing and significant debate, or does it model a alternative reality which essentially make a model which gives good predictions on the special and general relativity side, but not on the quantum mechanical side? And so you can't, I mean, even string theory itself, there's the mathematics that provides this sort of elegant solution, which I'm positive on string theory, although it does have problems, and some of the predictive problems of carrying over, here's what the math is, so here's what reality is. That's not an unsolved problem. That doesn't happen fast and easy.
Well, that part I'm not objecting to. So we don't know what T specifically refers to, whether it's A theory of time or B theory of time or whatever. We have no idea, but we know T makes successful predictions. So T refers to something in reality. We don't know what, and it makes successful predictions. So we have a reason to believe T, whatever it is, refers to reality. May or may not with proof, but we have good evidence. We do not have a leprechaun variable or a God variable.
Yeah, and so this is where, and I think, it is what it is. But for me to say, T, we don't know what it is, and it looks like something that may not be. It looks like the B theory, but it might be that we actually in an A theory universe. But it makes successful predictions, so we keep using it. I mean, to me, in terms of the origins of the universe and this discussion about God, and the idea that this would not be a prediction. I just think it's going to be a matter of taste. I mean, I don't know how else to do it. I think that when we're talking about the universe started in a way that had to be completely different than anything we've experienced. And now we're going to say, what kind of different thing than we've ever experienced? We know we're positing something that's unlike anything that we know, but what can it be like? And it can't be mind-like, even though we have, and again, it's a question of compelling and evidence. We have people who say they've actually experienced that. We can't posit it. It is fine, but it does go beyond physics to say what we're allowed to posit in when physics itself is saying this is beyond physics.
Well, I don't think it is beyond physics at all.
It has to be. The something out of nothing has to be. I mean, ultimately, the outside of this universe is, even the multiverse is kind of like, it is outside of physics, even if it provides some. I mean, we've got some things we can't explain that you can say, okay, here's a way that we could maybe explain these two things. But there's no way to test it, and that's all it does is this past explanation.
Well, I don't. That part doesn't seem to be outside of physics. So, like, the multiverse again is it's two equations. It's very simple. It's a very simple equation of goose early universe inflation and vacuum states demonstrated in the Casimir effect. That's it. That's all physics. It's just physics. There's nothing beyond
we can't answer.
Those are answered. Those are both things that have been answered and empirically verified. What we don't know is
not the cause.
The cause doesn't matter to this part of the argument. So the argument is that the multiverse is a combination of these two things. We don't actually know if they are actually combined in this way. That's the unknown. But these two are objectively verifiable phenomena that exist in the universe 100%. We know this. These are empirically verified things. And so the multiverse is nothing but physics. It's just physics. It's just using two
I disagree
physics phenomenon.
I think a lot of physicists disagree on that too.
What?
A lot of physicists would disagree with that. They think they find the multiverse to be just to defy Occam's razor and to be beyond what we're really doing, because we're talking about something that's untestable and beyond.
It's still physics, though. It's still just physics. It's just using physics equations.
I'd be really interested to see the definition. I mean, the way you're defining out science, your philosophy of science is something that's a little bit different than honestly what I've seen, and that's as somebody that. This is an area where I'm trying to puzzle out exactly how you're defining it. It's
combinations of knowns, principles, and particles of laws. That's it. That's physics.
Yeah, but you're allowing for novel discoveries.
Well, no. Combinations that are unknown of these things are perfectly fine, and there's infinitely many ways to combine these. So the known principles, particles, and laws are like Lego pieces, and you can combine them to build castles and fairy tale lands that don't exist and dragons, but what matters is the only pieces you're allowed to use in the model are combinations that have been verifiably demonstrated to exist. Principles, particles, and laws in physics. Physics is only allowed to use combinations of principles, particles, and laws that have been verified to exist. And you can combine them in all kinds of mysterious ways that make lots of gibberish that don't exist. 100% agree. But you're not allowed to add in a new Lego piece that you made up for no reason. That's not a thing. You got to empirically demonstrate it to have it as a Lego piece. Only Lego pieces you can use, empirically demonstrated ones in physics. That's That's what I'm using as the description here. So if you want to add in
Yeah,
the leprechaun piece,
it
that's
feels
the
like
flow of
I
physics.
just don't think that view of science as being sort of infinitely progressive fits with how science has actually worked historically. I mean, there's times where the explanatory framework, the whole thing gets tossed, right? The whole thing but a lot of the data carries forward, but we're now providing a whole different worldview. I mean, even just the move from geocentrism to heliocentrism, in that occurrence, we're gravity basically comes out of nowhere, where gravity had previously been explained where the earth was the center, but you get heliocentrism until Newton doesn't have a mechanism to explain it. The primary evidence for heliocentrism until Newton, and really Kepler, is that it's mathematically simpler. And there isn't a mechanism to explain how it is that the earth goes around the sun. Until you get gravity. So you actually have made a jump where this thing that there is no explanation for gets posited and ends up getting verified.
Right, but remember I mentioned earlier that if you want to posit a completely new thing, you're allowed to do that if you make novel testable predictions, because if you confirm it, then it becomes one of those foundational Lego pieces. So yeah, you can posit anything you want if it makes novel testable predictions, and if those predictions are confirmed, then it becomes one of the foundational Lego pieces that you get to add to the little plague pin.
But the heliocentrism then really has to wait on Kepler to be something that's viable. I mean, it's been popped out there, but the people that were opposing Galileo would have been actually in the stronger position at that point in time, because Galileo has not produced a mechanism. I mean, he's not produced.
Well, the mechanism part isn't what's important here. So if you have a novel testable prediction that the Earth goes around the sun and that the world is round, and you can make a prediction like doing the Eratosthenes thing where you stick the spikes in the ground and measure the shadows and say, if the Earth is going around the sun, we'd expect this pattern in the shadows, and they confirm it. That's a novel prediction. You can now say the Earth goes around the sun, even not knowing why it does.
Right. Yeah, it feels like you're making an arbitrary distinction there that I don't think is a fit to how the history of physics has really gone or how physicists operate. But honestly, I'd have to poke around. I don't think there's any way to do it on a podcast like this. I'd be interested to poke around at some of the ways, the distinction between novel predictions, like you mentioned, WIMPs, or even some of the particles that we throw out there, and when we've got something that is the size of the cosmos, to be able to say, here's where the distinction is between, again, I hate to say the leprechauns word because I don't want to identify with that, but to say, here's the distinction between leprechauns and, and WIMPs or dark matter or whatever positive particle, the Higgs boson prior to confirmation, here's where the distinction is. I don't know that I'm going to be able to follow that on this call. But
Absolutely.
It's an arbitrary discussion.
Interesting discussion.
Yeah. So not discussion. I meant distinction. It seemed like there's a distinction point that may be hard to make carry over into the actual history of science.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting topic. And I think that from the research I've done, it does seem like it's the case in physics that this is the boundary point of what's allowed in physics is, if it hasn't previously made successful predictions or you don't make new ones, you're only allowed to use combinations of those old pieces. No new pieces are allowed to be inserted. And that seems to be the consensus among physicists as far as I can tell, which is why the majority of them are atheists.
I think that's arguable, but in terms of
I'm stealing it directly from Nima Arkani Hamad. He's
and maybe that would actually be where the part of the distinction is. I mean, the methodological approach within science, I think the question is whether how do we avoid making science into the scientific method, into science basically into a kind of really a silo where it's not allowed to. And let's say we saw something like you and I saw something that was we were standing on the street, we saw something we just could not explain. It was just impossible to explain. It was Dr. Strange walking through a glowing hole and then stepping out. Are there limitations on what we're allowed to ask if we're approaching it as a physicist that wouldn't allow us to even posit some things that there's a way that we can define science so that it doesn't get to ask about how the world really is. It only gets to ask about how the world can be tested. And I don't think we want to do that and then make that our overall epistemology. I mean, the question of, is God the best explanation to use in physics, or should physics continue to explore other ways to explain the origin of the universe? I would say I would not want to tell physics, don't keep asking questions about how it came to be. Keep exploring that. Like, look for things that are within the explanatory framework of physics. But I would also want to say that doesn't mean I don't think that God was the origin of the universe. I'm saying I don't know how big the universe is. And I guess maybe I would even say I don't even know when it really started. So if we said, hey, we've got explanations for how space and time exploded into being, I'd find that fascinating, not troubling. So, but it wouldn't make me say, okay, well, now God's gone from that gap, so now we don't have a gap at all. To me, and I think permanently, but hey, I can't predict your 20 years from now AI computer world. I think permanently the something instead of nothing, the elegance of the universe. I think I've seen enough of glancing morality being oh man, you're going there, but beauty, morality. I think some of these things would still be compelling to me in terms of God's existence as the best explanation for the whole of the universe. But I have no idea what your computer would say. And I would never want to tell science or physics, stop looking into it, stop asking the questions, stop researching it. Don't worry about it. God did it. So don't ask, don't look. That's methodological without regard to the overall commitment to, without regard to the overall commitment to the idea that a person is the origin.
Oh yeah, so there's a few things I wanted to comment on there. One, I'm a moral realist. There's a recent poll. Most philosophers are atheists, but they're also moral realists, so you don't need a God to believe in morality. And I think that the secular models are better than God-based morality. I think they more conform to the evidence. And so I think that in the case of morality, beauty, the elegance of mathematics, I think all of those can be better explained without a God than with a God. But I do want to go back to...
You admit it's a topic of debate. I mean, it's not
everything. I'm a philosopher. Everything is a topic of debate.
It's not a philosophical consensus, and there's plenty of argument on that point.
So I wouldn't say that.
It's definitely not a philosophical consensus.
Right. It's just most philosophers are atheists and they happen to believe in moral realism without a God. That's just most of the case. I think there is a consensus that the God-based morality has more problems. I think that is a consensus. It's very bad for many reasons. But I wanted to go back to your example of the Doctor Strange thing. So let's say we see the Doctor Strange portal guy walk into a portal, and as scientists, what are we methodologically allowed to do at this point? I would say that the first thing is we're only allowed to use combinations of past demonstrated events. So the first thing is delusion. Delusion is the first thing that comes to mind. It was probably a delusion, but let's assume that was false. And this was actually a phenomenon. You can say, all right, person B is like, okay, it might have been a delusion. That's probably the best evidence we have. It's more rational to infer delusion. Let's say it's true. In order for that person to hold a rational position, they have to make a novel prediction and say, if it's true, I expect it to happen again. And if it happens again, it's going to happen. We can test it. We're going to have to make some predictions about what we could do. Can we throw something into it? And will it be gone when it's there? So like, let's say if it happens again, can we throw a baseball into it? And if we do, the baseball will be gone. We'll never be able to find it. That would be a good novel prediction you can make of some experiment you can do to possibly confirm that, oh, it's not just a delusion. And so I think this would be the process that methodologically science would have to entail. It would start as, nope, delusion is the only rational conclusion here. You got to go with delusion. And then you can make a hypothesis that is less supported to infer something else that it's actually real. But then for that hypothesis to be rational, you have to test it. Say it's going to happen again, make a novel prediction. And if you don't do that, it's irrational to believe that. It's a hypothesis, but it's irrational to believe that the rational conclusion is going to be delusion 100% of the time. And I think that methodology is the correct methodology to use, and that's the one science I think endorses.
Yeah, so I think that's great. That's perfect, because I think what that illustrates is there is this weird level at which if it only happens once and it never happens again, but it really did happen.
Yeah,
we functionally say of science methodologically, we're going to have to end up, because I'm with you. Like I would, even if you and I both experienced it, I'd still probably be on the side of like it had to be a delusion. Like I don't know what just happened, or it was a trick, it was a magician, it was an illusion, all of that. But if in reality, what that was is a person making a one-off choice to walk through a portal into the multiverse, right? And we just happen to be there and see it. And the person never makes that choice again. It never happens again. There is a world in which it did happen, even if the scientific methodology effectively says, but we can't believe it. We shouldn't believe it. And that's part of what, I love David Hume. He's my favorite philosopher. And part of his point on miracles, I mean, the beauty of it is he effectively stated why you can't disprove miracles. But then he had a great argument for ultimately it's always better to believe that people were deluded than to believe the miracle itself. And if you look in his footnotes, he's got some stuff about some of what was going on with the Jansenists and some of the Blaise Pascal's sister, and some of what seemed to be these reports of miracles, where it almost sounds like he's like, I really feel like that's probably, it's like it sounds really true, but I'm not allowed to believe it methodologically. And I think we get to a place where our methodology is going to require us not to believe something that actually did happen. Then there's something troubling about that.
Wait, why? That seems like your standard for a requirement of methodology is absolute knowledge or perfect knowledge or something. Because it seems like always any methodology is going to have that problem. No matter what you do, you're going to have to be able to doubt you could be wrong here. And there's going to be some kind of a threshold of evidence that has to pass. And before that threshold, even if it's true, you're not rationally justified in believing it. And the only way to like construct a methodology without that problem would be to believe literally everything. Which seems to have the opposite problem, that you're going to believe mostly false things. And so there has to be some kind of a methodological limit of this amount of justification is required. And before you get to this amount of justification, anything is irrational to believe. And therefore you wouldn't be rational to believe a true thing, even if it happened, until you had that. So for example, say there's something you don't know, an alien popped to the other side of the planet. It's invisible. We can't detect it. Is it rational to believe that that happened? Well, no. Like, we have literally no evidence of it.
But if I'm there and I watched it, then to have an epistemology that says I saw this occur, so I'm allowed to believe it, even if then it doesn't provide me with the ability to test it in physics, to be able to provide the scientific evidence that I'm allowed to believe it because I saw it, is not an irrational epistemology. That's a rational epistemology, and many epistemologies would allow that. I mean, the idea of a belief. The search for certainty, and this is part of where, I mean, yeah, it's not testable. We can't verify it. We can't prove for other people. In fact, if I told my friends about it, they're one step removed from the observation, and they should be less willing to believe it. But to define an epistemology that does not allow me to believe what really did happen because it doesn't fit within the epistemological rules, that's pretty tough.
So
I just saw it happen.
Well, so there's a difference between it happened and I saw it happen. So like, suppose something happens like aliens.
In terms of what I'm positing is that it did happen.
Well, right. No. So like, say something did happen, but we have zero evidence for it. Never saw it. Like aliens came and they're invisible.
Sure.
Like obviously there's no rational methodology that could get you to rationally believe that happened if there's no justification for it.
That's right.
Every methodology is going to have a problem where something can happen, and if you don't have a justification, you're not rationally justified in believing it, even though it happened.
Yeah.
So then there's the second question of, let's say I have a personal experience of some event happening. Am I rationally justified in believing it simply by virtue of the fact I had a personal experience of believing it? And that part, I'd say, if it was the case that our personal experiences had evidence that they were reliable, maybe. But I'd say because we have significant defeaters for that in the form of knowing that our personal experience is unreliable, any rational methodology is probably going to accommodate that data and say, no, you're not going to be rationally justified in believing you saw that, because of all of the defeaters we know about personal experience and how terrible they are. We know tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, misconceptions, hallucinations, all kinds of things. And because we know those exist, there can't be a rational methodology that starts with, I saw it, therefore I'm rationally justified in believing it's true.
And yet, I think if you're in the position where, I mean, and it would be entertaining to have this experience and see what happens over the ensuing months. Right, you just watched it happen. You saw it happen. You do the examination of it. But in positing a world in which it really did occur, I think that really is helpful in a sense that you're defining an epistemological framework where I'm not actually allowed to believe something that I just experienced, and that's fair. But there are epistemological frameworks that would allow you to have a kind of weak, like, hey, I believe that happened, but I might be wrong, versus I can't believe it because I can't demonstrate it and it can't go forward.
Well, is there a rational way to do that? Because I don't think there is. Like,
yeah, no, I think several of the responses to postmodernism and relativism do that. I mean, I think that the post-foundationalism and reformed epistemology, Alvin Plantinga and Wolterstorff, and I see you smiling.
I'm very familiar.
Yeah, of course you're familiar with it. But post-foundationalism, I don't know if you're familiar with that. That has more to do with the network of beliefs and the best overall explanation. But there's a kind of there's a kind of fallibilism about any individual point of belief, looking for a best network across huge systems of belief. But there's a little bit of a reduction of the need for certainty on individual points, while looking for a best overall model of all of reality. And
so I'm a fallibilist. I grant fallibilism, absolutely. But in the case, like, so for Reformed epistemology, I'm happy to grant the first premise that beliefs are justified until defeaters are presented or something along those lines. But the problem is that we have defeaters for personal experience. We have thousands of defeaters for personal experience. That has been defeated.
Not that one. This is a particular experience. I mean, like, so I think if you and I had this experience, especially if we're then talking about it, the defeater of we got to have been wrong. Like, I'd have this conversation with you and I'd enjoy it. And I'd be like, yeah, we had, but how do we explain the fact that we both saw it? Like that we'd be able to go forward and say, my system tells me I'm not allowed to believe in this anymore. I think you probably still would. I mean, I think the thing is that we probably, if we'd experienced it, we'd probably be sitting there and saying, but I saw it, but it happened right in front of me. And yeah, I know other people say that and they're wrong. I know that we have examples of hallucinations. I know maybe we ate bad coffee, maybe we had, bad eggs at breakfast or whatever it is, but I saw it happen. The claims about the sort of the structure of the epistemology to say I'm not allowed to believe in it, though. I think that's a helpful clarification in terms of the epistemological system. And I wouldn't go that far. I'd say I'd probably walk away going, I saw this happen. I have no way to test it. I believe that it occurred, but I might be wrong.
Right. And I think that would be, I don't think you can get a rational methodology that gets to that conclusion. I think any rational methodology, including the knowledge of our bereavement delusions, hallucinations, those kinds of fallacies, would have to say, based on the evidence we have, you have to conclude it was probably a delusion, so probably false.
Yeah, I think that's just a fascinating claim. I think that the fact that would bring doubt in for me, like, I mean, I really do. I find that a fascinating claim. I think that for me, epistemologically, to be able to land on a system that says, I saw it, there's a good chance that I'm wrong because of all of these other pieces of evidence. But actually, while I know that empirical evidence has all these flaws and human observation has all these flaws, all these different things, I also know that by and large, when I see a bus coming, if I walk out in the street, I get hit by it. I know that by and large, when I see people on the sidewalk, they're really there. If I run into them, it's bad. And if I behave by and large, it's reliable. And I just saw this. And so to me, an epistemological system that would be more reasonable would allow me the space to say, I believe it, even though I actually can't prove it to anybody. And I probably won't tell people because they'll say I'm crazy, except I'll call my buddy Tom and say he saw it too. And he's going to then say, well, I can't believe in it. I didn't see it. I don't know what happened because I'm not allowed to because of my epistemological system. I think that's fair. I just don't think I think that's an epistemological claim that is very narrow and it's very Vienna Circle and limited.
Well, so my question is more generally, let's suppose you're making the claim that there is a rational epistemology that can do this, that can say, I saw it, therefore it's rational for me to believe it happened. I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe there is a logical system that can accommodate that, given what we already know, given our past data. And so my question is how can you do that? So we say, you gave the example of you see a bus coming, if you walk in front of it, you get hit by the bus, you touch that person.
That was a bad example because then I stopped believing things from then on, but go ahead.
So we know that our direct experiences are reliable in many cases of I saw a dog, reliable. I saw this person the other day, reliable, et cetera, et cetera. There's many cases where personal experience is reliable. Like I saw somebody murder that guy. That's reliable.
Yeah.
But there are some cases where it's not reliable and where the vast majority of cases seem to fail, which would be miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, the class of things that have not yet been empirically demonstrated to exist, when experienced through personal experience, seem to be universally false. And so it seems like in those cases where we do experience those things that are outside of the empirically verifiable realm, it is far more likely that they are a figment of our imagination because they can be explained by other empirically demonstrated things, the delusion, hallucination, etc. And so it would be, I don't know how it could possibly, you could construct an epistemology or methodology that could accommodate simply the fact that you have an experience of one of these things and not, because of all of that past data, rationally conclude it was a delusion. I don't see how you could construct a rational epistemology to do that. It seems like that would just inherently have to be an irrational epistemology because you're ignoring all of the past data we have about this class of events.
But you're not, you'd be ignoring it. And you'd be ignoring it if what you did was just simply ignore it. What I'm suggesting is not that you ignore it. What I'm suggesting is that that's why you'd have a significant fallibilism surrounding that, around that claim, because you would say, look, I know that there's other explanations that are probably right because this was so weird, but I saw it. I mean, I think if you had the personal experience, it's hard for me to imagine that I could have some kind of like personal experience like that and then come away from it, especially immediately afterwards, not thinking like that happened, and almost in a combined state of I know there's really doubts about it, and then kind of working through those. But in the long term, a position that allows the fallibilism, but allows those there's some circularity to argument about all of these having been shown to be basically just psychological events or lying, which I think is most common.
Well, I think like all the ones we've tested have come to
where we've got the evidence to it. I mean, the historical, it's really hard to go back and say that about historical items, but in terms of what we've got, it's defining the epistemology in a way where you don't even have the ability to say like I saw it and I believe it. I think there is a way to build out a fallible. I think the post-foundational system of the sort of network of belief would allow you space to say I really got to take seriously all the reasons I might be wrong, but I saw it. And so, and again, positing this actually being an event in the world, that I'm allowed to believe in this world as opposed to being defined into not being allowed to believe this reality that occurred.
Yeah, so like a form of coherentism or something. It seems like I don't understand how you can use a coherentist model to say, here is a tool that has been proven to be unreliable, and we're going to use it and believe it in this context. It's like, here's a broken compass. So if you shake it, it points in a different direction. But when I shake it this time, I really like it when it points in this direction. I'm going to believe it now. That seems irrational. It seems like the definition of irrational. And so if we have a tool like personal experience that has been proven to be an unreliable tool, I don't understand how using a coherentist model to try and map it onto previously other held beliefs.
Yeah, it's not quite coherentism, but that's similar. It's similar enough to work for this. Yeah.
Okay, so but I don't understand how that can make it justified in this case. If we know it's a broken tool, we know it's a broken tool.
We don't. I mean, broken tool that's got odds of being wrong, not that it's guaranteed to be wrong. I mean, so again, you're playing the odds, and again, I think that's where what you're saying is very much like Hume in terms of what's the most reliable answer. It's interesting to me. I mean, Hume seemed to put it in there where it's more like a historiography. This is a rule for what we're going to accept. Even if belief in some way seems to be, even in his own view, it's like almost on the side. Like, I think some really weird stuff happened, but I'm not allowed to believe it.
Well, I think rationally believe it. I think you could believe it, but it just wouldn't be a rational conclusion based on the evidence or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I don't see why that's a problem. I don't see how you could have it any other way. Kind of like the belief that we mentioned earlier that can something true happen, but you're not methodologically justified in believing it. Well, of course, if there's no evidence, you're not rationally justified in believing it, even if it happens.
But there is evidence in this case. It's just a matter of which are you weighing. And I mean, you've established a rule for which evidence counts the most, and that's fair. But I think that's it. Is that our system is establishing rules for what counts as evidence most powerfully, and that always is the case. But the rule here is in some sense justifying then the lack of belief in anything that's out of this ordinary testability. But those things psychology really is people are really one of the best examples of that, because people are so arbitrary, especially if you were to add in something like mental illness. There's all kinds of things that go on that are not going to be repeatable until you get to sociological averages. And this would be an event that's a person event. And I think that's one of the problems for putting God into physics that we talked about way earlier is it's a person versus a process. But anyways, I would disagree with you about the ability to put together a rational epistemological system that allows me to have I think this happened, but it may not have, versus I'm not allowed to believe this happened. To me, those two, I don't have any problem saying that, an epistemological system could give you the ability to say, I think this happened, but I could be wrong. And even list out all the reasons why you could be wrong. But to say, but I saw it and I believe it did happen. I don't understand it.
Yeah, I'd be interested to try to see more about a theory that attempts to do that and to test it out into failure rate cases and see if we can apply it to a bunch of different cases and see how often it fails relative to the model I'm proposing, and see which one has a higher success rate on truth beliefs. And I'd say that I'm based on my biases, of course, I think that mine would do better. And I think that if we do have an AI that's evaluating methodologies, it's probably going to come out that mine, the one I'm using, is probably a more reliable guide to truth. And that's why it would be adopted by the AI.
Yeah, and reliability. I mean, that's where there's this sort of interesting way in which if you can adopt a system of epistemology that is going to work in the most cases, but then would produce a situation where you're not allowed to believe what really happened. I just think there's something interesting about getting to that place where I'd want I think building out an epistemological system that allows me to believe what really happened, but also acknowledges that, on a law of averages, if I were to get 5,000, because one of the pieces we're positing here is that this really did occur, whatever the cause, but it really did occur. Even knowing that in the case of, 1,000 other people reporting weird things on the streets, 999 of them were wrong, that I'm still allowed to believe, yeah, there's a good chance I was wrong, but I saw it. It happened. I think we can build that out. But I do think if it's about law of averages, then I wouldn't even necessarily say you're going to lose on a law of averages. I would say more, but the problem is you're actually restricting the ability to believe what's true from the outset because of rules that you've established on what's a justified belief.
Right. I would say it would require more justification than just your personal experience.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's.
But I wouldn't. I think that so in cases where there's insufficient evidence, you're not rationally justified in believing these things. Kind of like if there's no evidence, obviously you wouldn't be rationally justified.
Yeah. And sufficiency, right? Sufficiency is a range, and so people are going to argue about sufficiency, and they're going to argue. The average person on the street is going to be like, "I saw it, so obviously it happened," and then argue everybody. And the psychologist.
Right, so that's the question: what is the sufficient criteria?
Like, yeah, exactly.
And I think, of course, it's novel prediction. I think novel prediction is the most reliable method to distinguish imagination from reality. And I think that going under that is probably going to end up in a range where there's such a massive amount of imaginary things that can be justifiably believed as true that the methodology would fail. And so I think that there's the difference between that standard of novel testable prediction and below that standard is going to encapsulate a numerous amount of imaginary events as being real, and which I think is a problem for any methodology that does that.
Sure, but to me, excluding things that really did occur from what we're allowed to believe is also a problem for a methodology. And so I going into building that out would be interesting. There's obviously no way, especially given the time, but I think that would be interesting to explore, and almost what we consider to be like a non-starter on the limitations. And it seems like you're very willing to say, effectively, it's okay. I'm okay with the fact that this epistemological restriction that I'm placing means that I am not allowed to believe I'm not allowed to believe what I believe, effectively. Because in the moment, you're going to believe it happened. I mean, it's going to be a process.
Sure.
It's trying to stop believing things that you do believe, or trying to start believing things that you don't believe, is a really weird deal. And you'd be effectively trying to stop believing something that you did believe, or saying I'm not allowed to believe what I do believe.
Well, so how would that be different? An idea just came to my head. How would that be different? Let's say I see a pink elephant that's like Dumbo, cartoony kind of thing, pop into the sky and then flight down and take an ice cream cone and eat it and then fly up. Like, would I be rational in believing that just because I saw it? I would say, no, there is no way you could be rational in believing it just because you saw it. I think the same thing would apply to the Marvel example. If something happens that is so divorced from empirical reality, or empirically verifiable reality, I think any rational methodologist can be like, no, you can't believe it just because you saw it. I don't understand how, like, would your epistemology grant that as being something that the person is rationally justified in believing actually happened?
Well, so I would think the person is going to walk away actually believing that something occurred and then going, what in the world just happened? But so in my original example, where you and I are there together and we both saw the same thing, like the jointness of it adds an element to it. The pink elephant, if it's entirely unwitnessed, yeah, you know what? Look, I'm not long term. I'm gonna be like, listen, I swear I saw this, but I've had that experience where dream is so real that I'm like mad at somebody for what they did, and even after I know that it didn't happen, I'm still angry with them, just because it carries over in terms of the reality. Yeah, do I think that what I'd ultimately be doing there is saying, like, I have a hard time not believing this happened, but I just know that it couldn't have. But but where is that satisfactory line? To me, like you and I seeing the same thing together, or 3 people saw it, or man, 5 people reported, the pink elephant. It's still like, come on. If I hear that 5 people reported it, I'm like, yeah, 5 people are nuts, or they're lying, or how are they making money?
They took some funny mushrooms together.
Right, exactly.
Clearly.
But if I'm one of the 5 people, that there would be something that's like, but I saw it. And again, to carry the example over, I mean, part of the point that to make it actually matter is that it really did occur, right? So the idea being that in reality it did occur. And I think there's something fascinating about saying I've defined a methodological, an epistemological framework that prevents me from believing what really did occur. I just find that interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's necessary. I think that anyone, given our knowledge of how fallible human experience is, you have to have that. I don't think you can get rid of that. Like, obviously,
I think the distinction would be on can't, or maybe like, to what degree can you fallibly hold it and have more or less skepticism about your own belief?
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. It was a great conversation. We have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right. Travis Statham asks, how is theology different from writing fiction books? You add wishful thinking, ?
In terms of a legitimate, the process of theology, we're actually working from what we believe to be what God has revealed about himself in the nature of the world, the structure of the world, and then also what's called special revelation, which would be things like scripture. We're actually using philosophical tools. Most of what we're doing in theology is doing a study of the information that we believe we have, that certain people would dispute, that it is actually information. But we're taking information, we're trying to organize it, we're trying to understand it, we're trying to take, we're actually working to be able to collate it and be able to then apply it to the world to help understand and predict things that will occur in the world as well.
Gotcha. Next question is from JJ. It's for me. What is the value of consensus in philosophy without experiment? I think the value of consensus is in extrapolations from the experiments and methodological considerations. So consensus is one knowledge of the experiments that you know about, and so it's consensus that they agree that the experiments happen and indicate climate change or whatever, and so that's why it's consensus. Or it's consensus about methodology and what works and what doesn't. And so I think that there's the consensus of experts is a good measure of rational ways to assess a particular field. The nihilist question for Tim: is it rational to believe one person saying they saw a UFO or aliens? Does the case become more convincing if more people say they saw it? Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, I would say, look, the more I hope UFOs are true. Like, I think that'd be great. I'm not a UFO guy. The more people are saying it, when somebody has a one-off experience, especially like when I woke up and all these things happened to me last night, the more people see it, the more it becomes, especially when you just go with the language of unidentified flying object. Yeah, that makes it more reasonable, but still I'd be asking questions. I see all the videos that get dropped in the media recently, and I'm like, really, I want that. That'd be awesome if that was a UFO. Well, it is a UFO, I guess, but that would be awesome if that was actually alien. But do I think it's more likely that it's some kind of earthly technology? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unless the universe is really different than we think it is, it's the task of getting from here to anywhere meaningful, and anywhere meaningful getting to here is nearly impossible because of the time and space.
Yep. And I think that's another difference we have. I don't think the number of eyewitnesses matters much, because there's thousands of eyewitnesses of the Loch Ness Monster, tens of thousands of Bigfoot, hundreds of thousands of UFOs, millions of like miracles in Hinduism. I think that eyewitness testimony isn't really very reliable when it comes to miracles, magic, mythical creatures, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the number of people doesn't make much of a difference to those.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. It's just in the sense of like, I mean, look, do I think Bigfoot exists and do I think Loch Ness Monster exists? No. Would I've liked to have been on the
Hey, don't go against Nessie. Nessie's 100%.
Yeah, but would I've loved to have been on one of the research teams, trolling around in that lake to find out? Like, I think it opens questions up. I think it's fair for it to open up a question.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That part I think is totally true. I think you're allowed to hypothesize anything you want. I think that part is a door we should always keep open. Our Dying Sin asks, question: why is God important?
I read Pascal. I mean, Pascal's actually Pascal's fascinating on this point. I mean, he talks about us and our experience of the world and having this sort of innate, and I'm not talking about Pascal's wager here, but just his sense that we just, and I'm sure everybody doesn't experience this, like we matter, like life matters, the world matters, we are, there's more to this life than just what we experience. And that's not merely a religious, issue that goes outside of religion. Like we're made for more than this. And the question of God's existence is fundamental to the question of like, is there more meaning to this life? Is there more meaning and purpose than what we can see on a day-to-day basis?
I think that would be an interesting topic for a follow-up conversation. Does God or naturalism better explain morality? I think that's another interesting one. Next question is from Sabracadabra.
All right.
Would listening to the band Impaled Nazarene be a sin or for a bad Christian because they rock hard?
I have no idea, but I generally listen to whatever I wanted to. So,
gotcha. Lubo in China asks, could you ask him who created God?
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty standard, question. I think that the issue of there has to be something that exists differently than all the stuff that that we see on a day-to-day basis, which is all contingent. So the idea that there's some kind of necessary being, there's some kind of existence that's not contingent because there's something instead of nothing, that we're saying of that God is in essence, when we're talking about it, not from the religious standpoint, but just from the answer to the question of why is there something instead of nothing, it's no more than the word God really means nothing more than the non-contingent thing that exists, which functionally everybody has to believe in because we exist instead of nothing.
I think in physics, infinite regression is accepted pretty widely. So I don't think we need a necessary being.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of claims about what's accepted pretty widely. There's a lot of problems with infinite regressions.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Like I know that the Grim Reaper paradox, Pruss's and Rasmussen's infinite regression paradoxes, but those aren't actually, there's no logical contradiction there. I don't see why those are problematic. Like it'd be problematic if there was a I forget what the progression of time thing is, where it's tense theory of time, but there's even tense theories of time that don't have a problem with infinite regressions. I don't see the problem there. I don't see a difference between that and a necessary being in
actual infinities. I mean, I think that's again, it's disputed, but the actual infinities, and I kind of go back and forth on actual infinities and Hibbert's Hotel and some of those things. But you're actually positing an actual infinity at that point in time, and it's at least very, very strange. And again, infinities are bigger than our brains, but Hibbert's Hotel 2 days a week seems convincing to me. And then the other 5 days, I'm like, no, there can still be an actual infinity.
Yep. But like you said, there has to be something outside of our known realm of things.
Yeah.
So an infinite regress may be strange, but it's okay because it's outside of our known realm.
Yeah. So if you want to, like at that level, then it's figuring out which thing that's outside of our experience is the one that we're picking, so to speak.
I'm going magical potatoes.
All right. Well, at least it's not leprechaun, since I said leprechauns positively like 4 times on video. So that's
I'm going to clip that. We're going to put that on YouTube.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That would be really great. I'd be a big fan.
Pragmatic Crystal asks, how do you discern God from another entity?
I'm not sure that I follow the question completely, because God is, if we're speaking the way we're talking today, God's a very general term. To know the nature of God, I think this is one of the core problems for religion is, if God exists, how do we know him? Because left on our own, there's as many explanations, religious and non-religious explanations, as there are people. So, one of the fundamental positions of Christianity is that God actually came and revealed himself to us. It's not up to us to try to figure out who he is, because we'll all come to different conclusions.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's kind of the same question as before. Is like, it seems if we make any particular properties in a God, it seems like an arbitrary set of properties. Because like, if you want to say the universe must have been created by X, well then, and you're going to say X has some set of properties, why can't you just say the same thing about that set of properties must be created by some other set of properties, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean even the arguments. I mean the limited way. I'm not a huge fan of the arguments for God's existence, but the limited way that you can use them is to kind of say, hey, there is an argument that says there had to be something that started, but then what it is an open question. And then there's other, the argument from design, which more or less convincing to different people, especially but the argument from design would say, hey, it's rational. Argument from morality, the combination then of all of those things, then still doesn't get you to really anything more than a kind of general theism. The open question is, did God reveal himself to us or not?
So Mass Bandit asks, what do we both think of Bob Lazar's UFO stories?
I don't know. I got to admit, I'm not enough of a YouTuber. I don't know Bob Lazar's UFO. So if you tell me what I should think, tell me a little about it. I can tell you that what I probably think is, man, that would be really cool if that was true, but I don't think so.
I think, yeah, I'd probably agree. I think that all UFO stories, from my epistemology, obviously, it's going to be the same as the Doctor Strange case of, you had an experience, probably a delusion. That's the only rational conclusion until you make novel predictions, and only after you make novel predictions do you have any real evidence. Thank you for the super chat, Efon. He asks, what is Tim's view on doxastic voluntarism?
I don't have a view on doxastic voluntarism.
I'm Googling it.
Yeah, I know. Me too. Good. I don't know if I'm like, okay, you never know when you're professor. Should I be embarrassed that I've never heard of this before?
I've heard it. I know I've heard the word before. I just don't remember what it is. It's philosophical doctrine that holds, according to which people have voluntary control over their beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I've never heard the terminology before. Yeah, there was a fascinating book on the ethics of belief that I read when I was doing my doctoral work that really seemed to imply that we were actually always in control of our beliefs. And I found that really fascinating because I just, that's not my experience. I mean, there's stuff that times that I believe and I wish I didn't, or that I sort of believe, but not every day of the week, or that I'm not quite convinced of. But I just don't find any evidence in my own experience. I can only speak to my own experience here, that I can just pick something and then believe it and not have any problems with it at all. That would be fascinating to be able to do that. I can't.
Yes. I mean, I think like the easiest test is believe the world is flat right now. Go.
Yeah.
Go.
And man, I run into those people. There's an amazing number of those folks that seems like more and more that pop up.
That's my fault because I have them on my YouTube channel because it gets tons of views. It's so many views.
Yeah.
So many views. But yeah. Let's see. Oh yeah, I think that'd also be cool if you could like make yourself believe that you're the sexiest man alive. That would solve a lot of problems. I would love that.
It might not work when you're outside of the house though.
Well, I mean, just the confidence thing, just being able to have confidence when you're doing things, I think would be an amazing superpower that would help a lot in life. The ability to gain self-confidence whenever you needed it, just voluntarily, like self-confidence, done. That would be really cool if people could actually have doxastic voluntarism for those.
I don't know, man. A lot of people I know that seem to have that ability don't really work well and function well in society either.
Bloviator Bummer asked, how did God create something out of nothing?
Yeah, I think when we start asking the question of like all of that, when it goes beyond what we've experienced here, it's the same problem for everybody. Like, I don't know. I mean, that's not part of what we get to. That's above and beyond what we can say from inside of the universe, whether we're saying God or not God as the explanation for why there's something instead of nothing.
Yeah, and I think that's because I don't think something came from nothing. I don't think there was ever a nothing. I think
right. But that's actually still a question though. Why? I mean, I think to me, Leibniz was really good on this point. Like, even if there was an infinite something, why is there an infinite something instead of nothing is still a legit question to ask.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a fan of brute facts. I think that brute facts are perfectly fine. I think there has to be brute facts necessarily. I think even a necessary being that would qualify as a brute fact under my definition. So I think that would be my explanation.
I mean, fair enough, but it still is I mean, yeah, obviously you have to answer that way. Like, it does exist. So but it's still bizarre. It's just really weird that there's anything. It's weird that we're having this conversation. It's absurd that there is something instead of nothing.
Yeah. And I think another one for like the fine tuning is the same kind of a thing. Like, even if you consider the universe fine tuned, God would also have to be fine tuned in some sense. And the solution could be because of he's a necessary being and it's a part of his nature, but you can just again apply that to the universe. And so I think the same thing falls back on explanations of fine tuning, because whatever fundamental nature of reality you posit has to be as fine tuned as anything else we see in the universe. And it has to be for a reason, which is going to be a necessary being, brute fact kind of a solution. Travis Statham asks, can you define God to an agnostic?
So with respect to the conversation we're having today, what I'm saying that God is an infinite, necessary, personal being who created this universe.
Yeah, I think that works. Because I'm not an agnostic, or believe that God is meaningless or incoherent, like doesn't have any actual content to the sentence anymore than like.
Or they may just be questioning. I mean, I guess I would call somebody agnostic if they're just like, I don't think there's enough evidence to believe one way or the other on this.
I think it specifically means meaningless. I think the agnostic ones are meaningless.
Oh, agnostic. I'm sorry. Yeah. I was reading that as a typo.
Oh yeah. No, he's being serious about
the
positions that it's meaningless or incoherent. Can you make it coherent or meaningful to the people who think it's meaningless is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, if it's providing even just in the limitations of our conversations, providing explanations for existence, that certainly isn't meaningless.
Yeah, I would agree. I think like the concept of a mind creating the universe is perfectly coherent. I don't see why that would be meaningless in the sense. So I don't really understand the agnostic position in that sense, unless they're taking like a more strict scientific, like nomenological possible view that it must be a combination of physics or it's meaningless kind of a thing.
Right.
Travis Statham asks, what part of the Bible couldn't be explained naturally as delusion or lies? Why is this explanation implausible or less plausible?
Well, couldn't be explained. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly you can find, there's nothing in scripture that you can find that you couldn't say, hey, that's plausibly this disease or that disease. There's some stuff that's harder than others. The number of people who are referenced as eyewitnesses, again, as long as you don't if you consider the text to be, when you add in the ability of people to be lying on purpose, which then you got to find motivations for it. But if you add that part, if you add that part in, then you don't have to worry about eyewitness numbers or any of those claims. You've got some other issues on why it was regarded, but certainly there are people who have taken every piece of it and tried to say, here's an explanation that says it's false. And yeah, they're all plausible. That stuff happens. People lie.
I think communal reinforcement would be my answer to the group hallucinations, because group psychosis does happen. Folia do is a thing. Folia tree thing. Bereavement delusion and communal reinforcement. You get large groups of people to see the same thing, and that's why.
Yeah, there's lots of arguments. I think on combination. I mean, you're missing some of the elements that are usually there in terms of the people who are kind of the leaders benefiting from it, them getting wealthy, having power. They really in their lifetime didn't have power. Life was pretty brutal, but it's still an argument. It's still an argument that's defeated if the presumption is that it's false.
Right.
Especially this far backwards.
I don't think those are common in communal reinforcement. Communal reinforcement is more just people in the community think it's ghosts, and somebody who's an authority figure says it's ghosts, even if they get no money from it.
Sorry, I'm speaking more generally. I was not speaking just about the group events. I'm speaking more generally about the propagation of the faith, why it grew, why it was written down, like the whole thing that has to be explained. I mean, there are elements that are missing from what usually occurs, the way people revise their life, but it's still certainly possible to just explain it away.
Gotcha. Last question is from Masked Bandit. He says, have either of you done psychedelics? If so, what were your experiences?
No, can't say I have.
Not last week, like yesterday.
Like do it on video either. Yeah, when we see the Marvel experience on the that'll be one of the things I'll wonder about. But
yes, I accidentally did mushrooms one time and saw some things that clearly wasn't on purpose. Don't judge me. Yes. Yeah. All right, that's it for the questions. We've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
I know it's great. I mean, look, most of my work is in the classroom, and so there's really not places to point to unless you want to read a book with a lot of formulas on relativity and the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. And I was told every graph will reduce you by about 100 readers, and that's about right. So my mom read it, and it's in some libraries. But otherwise, happy to be here. And if you're ever in Fort Lauderdale, you can come take a class.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.